The storm raged outside his mansion, but inside, the silence was deafening. Richard Malone, the youngest self-made CEO in the city, stood at the window of his glass-walled office, staring out at the sheets of rain falling from the heavens. His heart felt heavier than the skies outside. On paper, he had everything. His tech empire was valued at billions. His name was whispered with respect across boardrooms and news headlines, and he lived in a mansion most would only dream of. But wealth and success had never protected him from the gnawing ache of loneliness. He knew betrayal well. He had been abandoned by friends who sought his money, and lovers who saw only the dollar signs attached to his name. He trusted no one anymore. And tonight, he was about to put one last test into motion, a test that could finally prove whether there was still someone in this world who could be trusted. He would leave his safe wide open. Before we dive deeper into Richard's heart-wrenching journey, please like this video, comment below, share, and subscribe to Stories Collection, if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of true character. Your support means the world to us and helps these stories reach others who need hope. Richard turned away from the window and walked into his private study. The safe was built into the wall behind a large portrait of his late father. Inside were millions in cash, priceless heirlooms, and confidential documents. He rarely opened it, but tonight, he pulled it wide open, leaving its contents in full view. It wasn't about the money. Richard had more than enough to last 10 lifetimes. This was about trust. He wanted to know whether the people closest to him would betray him when the opportunity arose. And there was only one person in the house that night, Elena, the new maid. Elena had been working for Richard for barely 3 weeks. She was a quiet, graceful woman in her late 20s, with a kindness in her eyes that almost made Richard uncomfortable. She never asked questions, never lingered in the hallways, and never touched what wasn't hers. But Richard had learned not to be fooled by appearances. Everyone had a price, he believed. He called her once that evening to bring him coffee. She entered the study hesitantly, her brown hair pulled back into a neat bun, her eyes avoiding the sight of the open safe. Richard watched her closely as she placed the tray on his desk and quietly excused herself. She didn't glance at the millions lying unguarded behind him. But the night was long, and temptation had a way of creeping in when no one was watching. Richard purposely left the mansion's security cameras turned off. He walked upstairs and waited in his room, pretending to be asleep. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. His heart pounded as he imagined Elena tiptoeing down the hallway, entering the study, her hands shaking as she reached into the safe. Was this another betrayal waiting to unfold? But when he finally crept back down the stairs, the safe was untouched. Elena was nowhere to be found, and Richard's suspicions began to twist into something darker. What if she had already taken something small, something he wouldn't notice? What if she had tricked him with her quiet demeanor? The following day, Richard decided to dig deeper. He called Elena into his study and dismissed her early without explanation, then checked every single item in the safe. Everything was accounted for. And yet, his mistrust wouldn't let him rest. Over the next week, Richard repeated the same test, leaving the safe open, the cameras off, and Elena alone in the mansion. Each night, he waited, certain that her true nature would reveal itself. But every morning, the safe was untouched. Elena continued her work quietly, scrubbing floors, dusting the high ceilings, and tending to the vast, empty rooms without complaint. One evening, as she left the kitchen after cleaning up dinner, Richard followed her silently and saw her sitting in the maid's quarters, holding a small, worn photograph. She stared at it with tears in her eyes before tucking it into her apron. Something about the fragility in her expression unsettled him. That night, instead of sleeping, Richard made a decision. He would find out who Elena truly was. His assistant, a woman named Clara, dug into Elena's background. The report came back shocking. Elena had once been a schoolteacher, beloved by her students, but she had been forced to quit after her husband abandoned her and their 6-year-old son. Unable to pay rent, she had taken any job she could find. She had no criminal record, no debts, no hidden life. Just a trail of hardships and heartbreak that she carried silently. For the first time in years, Richard felt ashamed. He realized he had been testing a woman who had already been tested by life far more brutally than he ever could. The next night, Richard descended into the kitchen where Elena was washing dishes. He noticed her hands were raw from hours of cleaning, and her shoulders were trembling from exhaustion. He wanted to apologize, to explain himself, but the words wouldn't come out. Instead, he asked her to sit with him. Elena hesitated but obeyed. Richard brought out coffee and set it on the table. He could see she was uncomfortable. Maids weren't supposed to sit at the same table as their employers. But he didn't care about the unspoken rules. As she slowly sipped the coffee, Richard asked about the photograph he'd seen her holding. Elena's eyes welled with tears as she told him about her son, Daniel, who lived with her sister because she couldn't afford childcare while working. She described how she missed tucking him in at night, how she saved every penny hoping to one day reunite with him. Richard's heart ached. For the first time, the wall of ice around it began to crack. He wanted to help, but he didn't want it to feel like charity. He simply listened as Elena poured out the pain she had carried for so long. The following morning, Richard walked into his study and closed the safe. He realized he no longer cared about testing Elena. She had already proven her integrity 100 times over. But fate had something unexpected planned. A week later, Richard's company was rocked by an internal scandal. A top executive had embezzled millions, and the press was tearing Richard apart. He withdrew into himself, working day and night to fix the mess. Elena noticed his sleepless eyes, the weight he carried in his shoulders, and quietly began leaving him warm meals outside his study. She never pried, never asked questions. She just made sure he ate. One night, Richard stumbled into the kitchen long after midnight and found Elena asleep at the table, waiting for him. He covered her with a blanket and stared at her for a long moment, realizing she was the first person in years who had given to him without expecting anything in return. Slowly, their relationship changed. Richard began to open up about his fears, his loneliness, his broken trust. Elena listened, offering quiet comfort. She encouraged him to reach out to old friends he had pushed away, to let go of the bitterness that had consumed him for so long. As weeks turned into months, Richard started spending more time outside of work. He visited charities, began reconnecting with people, and, most importantly, he arranged for Elena's son to come live with her again. The day Daniel arrived at the mansion, Elena wept openly, hugging her little boy as Richard watched from the doorway, his chest tight with emotion. In that moment, Richard realized the truth. Elena had given him something no one else had: hope. She had restored his faith in humanity. Years later, when Richard and Elena stood together at a charity gala, they had both come so far. Elena no longer worked as a maid. Richard had helped her return to teaching, and she had become a mentor to countless children. The loneliness Richard once felt had been replaced with a quiet, steady joy. He had not only gained a trustworthy friend but a family. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Stories Collection. Your engagement truly helps us continue creating powerful, inspiring stories that can change lives. Special request: before you leave, comment below, "I believe in kindness and second chances," to spread this message to others. Great! Let's expand this story into a fuller, richer cinematic version with deeper emotional arcs, vivid visuals, and added twists, so it truly fits the 6,000-word YouTube storytelling style. Below is the continuation and expansion, building upon the version I gave you. Lonely CEO millionaire leaves his safe open to test his maid, What she did next expanded. The mansion was a fortress of glass, steel, and silence. Richard Malone stood at the window as lightning split the sky, his reflection staring back like a stranger. His wealth towered like the skyscrapers he owned, but it was a prison of his own making. At 38, he had built an empire that controlled half the tech industry, but he couldn't remember the last time he had smiled, truly smiled. Friends, lovers, colleagues, every relationship had been tainted by betrayal or self-interest. It was easier to be alone. Or so he told himself. Tonight, though, Richard was tired of not knowing who to trust. He walked into his private study, pressed his palm to the biometric lock behind the portrait of his father, and swung open the massive safe. Bundles of cash, glistening gold, and confidential stock documents lay in perfect order. It was a temptation few could resist. Richard stepped back and left it wide open. He knew the plan was cold, but life had made him this way. There was only one other person in the house that night, Elena, the maid he had hired barely 3 weeks ago. She was young, soft-spoken, with tired eyes and a quiet grace that made her easy to overlook. And yet, Richard had learned long ago that appearances lied. The test had begun. If you're watching this and believe in kindness, trust, and the power of second chances, please like this video, comment, share, and subscribe to Stories Collection right now. Your support spreads hope and helps us continue telling these heartfelt stories. Hours passed. Richard pretended to sleep upstairs while his mind churned with suspicion. He imagined Elena creeping down the hallway, drawn by the gleam of gold and the lure of easy money. But when he descended the stairs at dawn, the safe was untouched. Perhaps it was luck. Perhaps she hadn't noticed. Over the next week, Richard repeated the test, leaving the safe open each night. Every morning, it remained as it was. Elena never mentioned it. She simply cleaned the house, did the laundry, prepared his meals, and disappeared back into her modest quarters. Richard wanted to believe in her, but the scars on his heart whispered otherwise. One evening, he found himself watching her from the hallway as she scrubbed the kitchen floor on her knees. Her hands were red and raw. When she stood up to stretch, he noticed her quietly slip a folded photograph from her apron pocket and stare at it with tears in her eyes. Who was she? Unable to suppress his curiosity, Richard instructed his assistant to run a background check. The report arrived the next morning, and what he learned hit him harder than he expected. Elena had once been a schoolteacher. Beloved by her students, admired by her colleagues. But her life had unraveled when her husband abandoned her and their 6-year-old son, Daniel. Forced to leave her career to find work that paid quickly, she had taken menial jobs. Her son now lived with her sister because she couldn't afford both childcare and a roof over their heads. There was no record of theft. No debts. No secrets. Just a young mother fighting quietly to survive. For the first time in years, Richard felt something unfamiliar: guilt. He had been testing a woman who had already endured more than most could bear. That night, Richard watched Elena from the doorway as she carefully cleaned the silverware. He wanted to say something, to apologize, but the words tangled on his tongue. Instead, he offered her coffee and asked her to sit with him at the long dining table. Elena hesitated but obeyed, perching on the edge of the chair as if ready to run. Richard asked about the photograph, and tears welled in her eyes as she described her son, his laughter, his love for drawing, how she missed him every night. Listening to her, Richard felt the ice around his heart begin to crack. Elena wasn't just trustworthy. She was kind. And kindness was something he hadn't seen in years. From that moment, the dynamic in the mansion shifted. Richard closed the safe and left it locked for good. He no longer needed proof. But life wasn't done testing either of them. A month later, Richard's company was rocked by an embezzlement scandal. A top executive had stolen millions, and the media descended like vultures. Richard worked day and night, trying to salvage the company. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping. Elena noticed. She began leaving warm meals outside his study, though he rarely touched them. One night, he stumbled out of the office at 2 a.m. and found her asleep at the kitchen table, waiting to see if he'd eat. He draped a blanket over her shoulders and stood there for a long time, realizing she was the first person in years who cared about him without expecting anything in return. Slowly, he began opening up to her. He told her about his childhood, about the betrayals that had hardened him, about the loneliness that no amount of wealth could erase. Elena listened quietly, never judging, never prying. One afternoon, Richard asked her to take a seat in his study. "I want to do something for you," he said. "Something that will change your life." Elena shook her head. "Please, sir. I don't need charity." "It's not charity," Richard said softly. "It's what you deserve." A week later, Elena's son Daniel moved into the mansion. The moment she saw him, she dropped to her knees and hugged him tightly, sobbing uncontrollably. Richard watched from the doorway, his chest tight. He had brought happiness to someone else for the first time in years. Months passed. Elena blossomed in ways Richard had never seen. She returned to teaching, this time at a school Richard quietly funded. Daniel thrived under her care. And Richard, once a man drowning in isolation, found himself looking forward to the sound of laughter echoing through his house. The mansion wasn't silent anymore. Richard no longer cared about tests, safes, or money. He had learned the greatest wealth was not in gold or power but in people who loved you for who you were. And one evening, as Richard watched Elena tuck Daniel into bed, he realized something he had never admitted before: she had saved him as much as he had saved her. Years later, at a charity gala, Richard stood beside Elena, no longer his maid, but his friend, his confidant, his family. As cameras flashed, he thought back to the night he had left. The safe opened and felt gratitude swell in his chest. Sometimes, the person you test ends up being the person who teaches you the greatest lesson of all. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Stories Collection. Your engagement helps us bring hope to millions of viewers. Special request: comment below, "I believe in kindness and second chances," before you leave. Your words might inspire someone else who needs it today.